Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another solo spooky story. My name's Rob, and I'll be your host. For those of you who don't know, the solo stories are shorter episodes every other week presented by myself, where they're just shorter episodes. It's a one-on-one sort of thing, and it's kind of just a different tone to the usual episodes between myself and Suze, and they're actually a good bit of fun to record and to look into. So yeah, they're fun to do. But I hope you're all having a lovely time whenever it is that you're listening to this. It's currently the week that this episode's actually getting released, so I'm recording it on a bank holiday Monday, which is just great. It's nice to have a bank holiday every once in a while, and I'm fortunate that the job that I work in allows me to have bank holidays off, so it's great. But yeah, I hope you're enjoying yourselves whenever it is you're listening to this, either having a cup of coffee or tea, or for some of you, you're out having a run, or whatever else you do when you're listening. It's always fun to hear the different routines that people have listening to these episodes and the main episodes as well. So if you have a different way of listening that we haven't covered before, do let us know, because it's fun to keep a list of the different routines that people have listening to us. It's just wild to think that so many people listen in different ways. But we're going to get into today's episode. So I recently saw Hokum, which is a new film with Adam Scott that's come out, and it's just brilliant. It was filmed in Ireland, and it's about Irish mythology. I don't want to give too much away, but it delves into kind of witches and things like that. And you know, it's really kind of inspired me to look more into more kind of Irish folklore and Irish stories. And I've recently been also trying to improve my level of the Irish language, and have been looking more into Irish stories, trying to understand them more, and to be able to actually understand the actual Irish language aspect to it rather than the translated version of it. So to kind of put all this together, it means I've been reading a lot more Irish mythology and folklore, and I have been studying kind of various different things. And I thought, having just watched a film about witches in Ireland and you know, with the Irish language and such, now is a great time, especially now that we're past Baltana, which is another Irish holiday, or I suppose Celtic holiday. Now is the perfect time to talk about another character within Irish folklore. So today we are going to talk about the Dullahan, which is effectively Ireland's Headless Horseman. And more so than that, the Dullahan is Ireland's, I suppose, harbinger of death, more so even than, I would say, the Banshee, which I'm actually aware that we haven't even done an episode on the Banshee yet, so we'll have to get into that at some point in the future. But the interesting thing about the Dullahan is that in, I suppose, rural Ireland, and I suppose in a historical context, you kind of have this image of this figure riding forth on a horse, whose very presence kind of chills the blood and stills the heart. And the Dullahan is this headless horseman of Irish folklore. It's more than this kind of just ghost story whispered by the fireside. He's actually a symbol of death's certainty. He's a supernatural omen whose legend has haunted the Irish imagination, I suppose, for centuries. He's often cloaked in black, and as I said, he's on a horse. And this character himself, the Dullahan, he's often said to be carrying his own head. And the Dullahan is at once this kind of terrifying spectre, but he's also this kind of cultural metaphor at the same time. And his legend, I suppose, is woven from ancient beliefs, oral tradition, and I suppose the evolving fears of generations and the knowledge of our own certainty of death, I suppose. And he just really kind of stands as one of the most vivid and enduring motifs in Celtic mythology, I suppose. The story, though, it's not merely kind of a tale of horror, but as I said, it's a narrative that reflects the Irish relationship with death, the supernatural, and the unknown. And I would like to think, and I've talked about it before on the podcast with Suze, that I think the Irish have we've a really interesting way of dealing with death. I think we've a very unique way of dealing with it, in that we kind of deal with it head on immediately. Not like kind of other cultures, and not to throw shade at other cultures, but other cultures who kind of shy away from death a little bit. I think the Irish experience with it is a lot more dealing with it head on. We have things like the wake. We, you know, celebrate life around the body of the person who's died. We talk about their life and I suppose memorialize them in that sense. And, you know, even as just like kids from a very young age, you know, you're kind of aware of death. you're kind of aware of death and the experience around it, and it's kind of almost normalized in a sense. As a child in Ireland, you kind of just, if you are unfortunate enough, I suppose, to have to go to a funeral, you do experience that kind of aspect to it, and I think we deal with it in quite a healthy manner because people aren't afraid to talk about it. They don't shy away from talking about death, and I think a lot of Irish stories and folklore as a result are kind of focused around death a lot, which is not surprising for a nation that has dealt with a lot of death in the past, but then also has a culture around dealing with it. So, as I said though, the Dullahan, it's not just, he isn't a figure who kind of just merely warns of death as the Banshee does, but he actually enacts it as well. And that's I suppose the interesting difference between the two of them. His arrival is the moment when, I suppose, your fate becomes reality, and when the boundary between life and death is crossed without any sort of chance of redemption. And the Dullahan's legend is rich in symbolism. There's regional variation, as with all things in Ireland, and there's a lot of cultural resonance with him as well. And he does actually continue to inspire fascination in literature, art, and popular culture right up to the modern day. So I suppose before we get into the stories of the Dullahan, I suppose we should talk about his name. So the name Dullahan, it's also spelled or pronounced Dullahan, Dullahan, and Dovlachan, and it's rooted in the Irish language, but it has, I suppose, little hints about what it actually means and what it translates to. So, Dullahan refers to the Irish word for like a hobgoblin or like a dark, sullen person. The stem of the word du translates to dove, which is black in Irish, and it's kind of more a description of the person's character. So it's a descriptor for being so closely associated with darkness and death, and it's also linked with kind of words around anger or maliciousness. But I suppose the dark or black, the dove, is the most literal translation. In Irish as well, the Dullahan is sometimes called Cullan Gan Ceann, meaning body without a head, and the coach he drives is known as the Cuishta Bother or the Cuishta Gan Ceann, and that literally translates to headless coach. So these names kind of reinforce the figure's, I suppose, defining characteristic in that he has no head, but then also his function as this, I suppose, supernatural, I suppose, harbinger of death. And I suppose even just seeing him lets you know that he's delivering death on someone, even if it isn't necessarily on yourself. And we may get into that later on with some of the myths that are out there about him. So the Dullahan's origins are fairly entwined with the ancient Celtic worldview, in that the boundaries between the living and the dead were quite porous, and supernatural beings kind of move freely between the worlds. And we've definitely talked about this before, even in the earliest episodes where we talked about the Tuatha Dé Danann. We've done an episode on the Puka. There's been other kind of episodes where we talked about it as well. There's that kind of boundary between the living and the supernatural in Ireland, and in Celtic mythology in general. It's a bit more as I said, porous. So the early references to headless riders and death omens appear in oral traditions in Irish history, but then later they do appear in written sources from the 17th century onwards. And the Dullahan himself is a distinct figure, most clearly documented in the 19th century collections of Irish folklore, in written form anyway. And I suppose the Dullahan is kind of this, supposedly is some sort of folkloric echo of ancient rituals that took place in Ireland and the greater kind of Celtic area, in which heads were offered to appease the gods. And I've seen speculation that his headless form may symbolize kind of the violence and the violence of death, and then I suppose the transition to the other world. But then there's also the direct connection between, this just being a headless rider and then delivering death as well, that it's a little bit more literal, that he's delivering death on them, and that the actual person who's delivering death is also dead himself. But it's just interesting. It's really, really interesting to see kind of the historical and mythological roots to him. So I know I've mentioned it before, but Irish mythology is fundamentally a product of oral tradition. It's shaped by centuries of storytelling, local adaptation, and I suppose the gradual influence of Christianity, and then leading to kind of reinterpretation of these myths. And the Dullahan's legend, like many, many others, was preserved and transformed through this process. So there's a number of collections that are out there. I believe one was by Thomas Crofton Croker. The collection, I think, is called Fairy Legends and Traditions of the South of Ireland. I believe it's from the early 19th century. This is one of the sources where he gathered tales from rural communities and then presented them in literary form. Now, I believe I did see some discussion online saying that he embellished a lot of the stories, and that he kind of synthesized variants from different regions into one to make, I suppose, a cohesive narrative. But just to say that there's a problem with this in the sense that you may not actually be getting the full story as it was told to him at the time. So that's problematic in itself. And then later on, folklorists and authors, namely W.B. Yeats and Lady Gregory, they actually popularized the Dullahan in their anthologies. They sometimes blended his story kind of with other motifs and figures, and the Banshee being the top of them, or the Gan Ceann, which is another headless spirit. They kind of linked in with them as well, almost creating some sort of like paranormal Avengers. And yeah, the National Folklore Collection in Dublin also has archives kind of preserving oral accounts discussing all the kind of folklore within Ireland, and the Dullahan features there as well. But I think what makes the Dullahan interesting is that it kind of occupies this unique position within Irish mythology and folklore, and kind of unlike the kind of more grander stories of like, Cuchulainn or things like that. This is more a figure of the kind of the liminal space. It kind of exists at this threshold between life and death, and it's kind of literally like the middle ground between the real world and the supernatural. And I think that's what kind of makes his legend kind of stay prominent in Irish folklore even to today. And yeah, he just really kind of embodies that idea that perhaps death isn't the end, but it's kind of a transition to the other world, and that it's the start of something else. And I think that's what has fascinated a lot of people throughout history, and still does, to be fair. So yeah, I just want to get into some myths that we have around him, and some practices to maybe potentially wade him off if you do have the unfortunate reality of having to deal with him. So one of the most celebrated Dullahan tales is the story of the Good Woman, and it was actually collected by Thomas Crofton Croker, who I talked about. The story follows Larry Dodd, who's a horsebreaker from a place near the Galtee Mountains. He's returning from Cashel with a newly purchased horse when Larry offers a ride to a cloaked woman. He then, for some reason, attempts to claim a kiss as payment, and he actually discovers to his horror that she is actually headless, that she's a Dullahan, the Dullahan in disguise. So Larry is drawn into a nightmarish vision in the ruins of a church, where he witnesses a wheel of torture with heads on it and the gathering of headless Dullahans. So now there's like multiple Dullahans in his story. He's then offered a drink, and as he raises the cup, his own head is severed. So he claimed then when he awakens, his head is restored, but his horse is gone, and that they basically, the Dullahans, plural, claimed it as payment to basically allow him to live. So the tale ends with Larry's wife berating him for his absence, and him remarking basically that a woman without a head is a good woman, or basically that she can't scold him. So the story, I think, it's pretty well known for its blend of humor, but then there's obviously horror to it as well, social commentary. But it also introduces this idea of multiple Dullahans, that it's not just this one character, but that there's basically, they've outsourced it effectively to numerous spirits to deliver the supernatural justice, I suppose. Another story then is called Hanlon's Mill, and this was also collected by Croker. And in this tale, Michael Noonan is the character, and he's returning home at night. He encounters a black coach drawn by 6 headless black horses, and it's also driven by a headless coachman. The coach passes by him silently, and the next morning Michael learns that Master Rickson of Ballygiblin has died suddenly, and the appearance of the coach is thus directly linked to the announcement of the death. There are regional variants of this story, particularly in Cork. There's some in Connemara as well, Fermoy, and some other areas. And in some versions of this story, the coach actually runs between Castlehyde and a glen in a different area known as Ballyhooly. and it apparently actually visited houses in succession and basically splashes blood on those who open their doors. And it's effectively a story of not opening the door at night because you'll get splashed by blood by the Dullahan and you're now marked for death. So it's clearly like a metaphor of like, once you're inside, lock the doors and that's it. Don't be answering them at nighttime, which is another, I suppose, famous folklore slash supernatural story. I think particularly in like the Appalachian Mountains and things like that, there's stories of if you hear your door knocking at night, don't open them. So this is, I suppose, maybe a link there as well. And if you really want to delve into it, the same mountain range that's in the Appalachian Mountains is actually in Ireland as well. In way like millions of years past, they were the same mountain range before tectonic shifts caused them to break apart. So maybe there's something there. And then finally, then another story, then I suppose the final one that we'll talk about is literally called the Headless Coach. So it's the legend of the Cuiste Boater, or the Headless Coach, and it's a central element in the Dullahan tradition. So the coach itself is actually viewed as a harbinger of death, so it doesn't even need to be the Dullahan himself. Once you see the coach, you're in trouble. And it basically, it's said to appear at the door of those whose time has come, and its passage is sometimes silent, it's sometimes accompanied by a rumbling sound, and it's often described as moving with supernatural speed. The coach's construction is allegedly from various human remains, and its association is linked with graveyards and carnal vaults and things like that. And it's basically, really just hammering home that this is like a death coach. Apparently its wheels are made of bones, its axle is made of like human spines. Like, it's really hitting home that this is the death coach, the Headless Coach. And in some accounts, the Banshee actually teams up with the Dullahan at this point, and she actually accompanies the coach as well. And together they form this like weird supernatural, I suppose, funeral procession of death. And I suppose just to acknowledge as well that the motif of this death coach, it's not unique to Ireland. There's similar legends appearing in Scottish and European folklore. But I suppose the Irish version is distinguished by its vivid imagery and integration with the Dullahan figure and with the Banshee. So it's a little bit more different in that sense. So what happens if you come across a Dullahan? What do you do? Like, is there anything you can do? Is there anything that you can do to prevent yourself from being taken? And yeah, there apparently is. There's allegedly some protective talismans and folk practices that you can take part in that I'll share with you now on the off chance that you do ever find yourself face to face or face to chest, I suppose, with the Dullahan. So, despite his overwhelming power, folklore offers one curious means of protection against the Dullahan, and that is gold. Probably shocking to no one. So even just a small piece of gold, a coin, a pin, or a ring can actually cause the Dullahan to recoil and retreat. And this detail is apparently found in several accounts. It provides this kind of, I suppose, slender thread of hope in an otherwise hopeless encounter. And I suppose the symbolism is ambiguous. Like, gold is the most precious of metals, and it allegedly is there to basically say that it can buy you a few moments of life, but it's not a reprieve from death. The belief is that gold's kind of protective power kind of led to folk practices in which people would carry small gold objects with them, especially when traveling at night, or during festivals associated with the supernatural, like Baltana, where we currently are now, or in other kind of festivals throughout the year. And just to say as well that the gold legend, it's not unique to the Dullahan. It does appear in other Irish legends as well. But I suppose it's particularly striking here because it kind of sets this small, I suppose, everyday object, like a ring, I said, or a pin, against the unstoppable force of death. That kind of makes him retreat and then come back for you another time. So maybe carry around a little gold coin or a pin or a ring in your pocket if you're that particularly worried about the Dullahan. Maybe it'll buy you some time. But yeah, I suppose in the context of historical Irish society, the Dullahan kind of served multiple functions. On one level, as I said, it was probably a cautionary tale, warning against venturing out at night, especially during festivals when there was that belief that there was the space between the two realms, life and death, was narrower. But I suppose as well, it kind of reinforced kind of social norms and behaviors. It was kind of that fear of encountering the unknown led to practices such as staying indoors at night, carrying gold for protection, or observing rituals during festivals like Samhain, where people were building up these traditions around this, and it kind of almost became its own structure to communal life and things like that, and kind of provided a sense of routine in what you had to do. And it necessarily wasn't even to do with the Dullahan after a certain point. It was just, this is what you did in Irish society. So yeah, that kind of concludes where we are. Like, the Dullahan is still talked about today. Like, it's obviously, even in the legend of Sleepy Hollow, you've got a direct link to the Headless Horseman there. It's still very much so talked about in kind of video games as well. Like, Castlevania has a reference, Final Fantasy has various references to the Headless Horseman and Headless Warriors. And yeah, even modern day version of Halloween that we still celebrate, it does frequently incorporate the Dullahan's imagery. And it's, I suppose, just keeping the tradition of the Dullahan and the story of the Dullahan alive, just maybe in different ways now than what have been previously done in the past. But yeah, that's kind of it. It's a really interesting kind of piece of Irish folklore, I believe anyway. The Irish folklore just in general, and the mythology and history and how they kind of became intertwined, it's just fascinating to me. And I think the Dullahan, as I said at the start, it speaks to, I think, the Irish fascination and how we deal with death. No doubt it's inspired it anyway. So it's just, to me, it's a really interesting topic to talk about. But yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and if you've any other, I suppose, mythological creatures or beings or folklore that you'd like us to talk about, do let us know. You can let us know on social media. You can get us on Threads and Instagram at the SpookAF Pod. You can email us at the spookafpodcast@gmail.com. You could leave a comment on the Spotify episode when this goes up, or you can get us in the YouTube comments as well when this episode goes up. So yeah, there's loads of places to get us, and I'd love to hear from you. But with that said, I hope you're having a lovely day whenever it is you're listening to this, and I'll catch you in the next one. Take it easy, guys.